Ancient Greece is well known for its democracy and great philosophers, but there's a hidden part of this history, the disturbing lives of slaves. Imagine living under the shadow of beautiful temples and busy markets, but as a slave facing tough times. These tales of slaves are usually forgotten and their hardships often unseen in history books. Welcome to Uncharted History. In today's video, we'll dive into the harsh realities faced by slaves in ancient Greece, uncovering some shocking truths about how they were treated. The harsh reality. Ancient Greece heavily depended on slavery. In 5th century BCE Athens, about 1/3 of the population were slaves. They played key roles in Greek daily life and history. These slaves did various jobs, from tough work in the Larium silver mines to housework and even intellectual tasks. But their stories and roles are often overshadowed by other famous aspects of Greek history. Now, let's explore some of the toughest things that the ancient Greek slaves suffered. Number 7. War captives turned slaves. In Greek history, captives from wars and conquests often had a harsh fate. The Iliad from the 8th century BC shows many slaves were women taken as war prizes, while men were usually killed or ransomed. A notable example is Eumaeus from Homer's Odyssey, a male slave important in his master Laertes' household. Also, Hesiod's 8th century BC work Works and Days mentions demoes, or slaves, even though it's not clear what they did. Draco, Athens' first lawmaker around 620 BC, even had laws about slaves, showing their role in society. This practice of enslaving war captives was common and strangely coexisted with Greek democracy. Being enslaved was a big change, not just physically but mentally too. As Eumaeus in the Odyssey shows, it robbed people of their dignity and virtue, highlighting the human tragedy of this practice. Number 6. The unseen agony of galley slaves. Another dark part of ancient Greek slavery was the suffering of galley slaves. In the 5th and 4th centuries BC, during big manpower needs or emergencies, Greek navies used slaves as rowers. These slaves, often war captives, faced very hard conditions. They had to power huge warships, needing a lot of strength and stamina. Life for these galley slaves was tough. Chained to their oars, they were the force behind warships, rowing for hours, under the threat of punishment. The conditions they endured were horrendous, with little food, cramped spaces, and almost no rest. Disease and death were rampant among them due to these inhumane living conditions. Many galley slaves never lived to see freedom, succumbing to exhaustion or illness. Their plight is a grim reminder of the human cost of ancient warfare, often overlooked in historical narratives. Number 5. Domestic servitude in Athenian households. In ancient Greece, especially Athens, slavery was more than just hard work in fields or mines. It also included being a servant in homes. Aristotle once described a slave's life simply as work, discipline, and feeding. This view reduced human lives to just their usefulness, in stark contrast to Athens' intellectual culture. Orlando Patterson's concept of social death fits here, as slaves were treated as non-persons, only valued for their service to their masters. In the Odyssey, slaves are important in households, but are seen as lower status. For example, Eumaeus the swineherd, though important in his master's home, laments losing his virtue due to slavery. This mix of important household roles and the total dehumanization of slaves shows a big contradiction in Athenian society. Even though Athenian slaves were thought to have a happy lot by some like Pseudo-Xenophon, the reality was often harsher. The escape of 20,000 slaves at the end of the Peloponnesian War shows how unhappy and desperate they were. Number 4. Punishment and control. Next, let's look at the harsh punishments and control methods in ancient Greek slavery. Draco, an Athenian lawmaker around 620 BC, allowed a lot of violence against slaves. This let slave owners use many kinds of punishments. Physical beatings were common and often brutal in ancient Greek slavery. Whipping was a regular punishment, with some masters using special whips designed to inflict maximum pain. Shackling and chaining for long periods were also common forms of punishment. In addition to these, other cruel methods included forced starvation and exposure to extreme weather as a means of discipline. Slaves might also be subjected to public humiliation, often being paraded or displayed in the marketplace as a warning to others. Furthermore, isolation, such as being confined in small dark spaces, was used to break the spirit of rebellious slaves. These varied forms of punishment served not only as a direct form of control, but also as a constant reminder of the slave's powerless status in Greek society. More extreme methods included branding with hot irons, especially for slaves who tried to escape, marking them as offenders. Some slave owners even mutilated slaves, like cutting off fingers or toes, for theft or other serious crimes. Another harsh punishment was forced labor in dangerous conditions, like in mines, where many didn't survive. In addition to these, slaves could be sold off to even harsher masters or sent to fight as gladiators, a near certain death sentence. The threat of selling a slave's family members was also used as a psychological tool of control. The use of collars with inscriptions that detailed the slave's offenses was another method to publicly shame and control them. These extreme forms of punishment reflect the total lack of rights and brutal treatment slaves faced in ancient Greek society, often seen merely as property rather than human beings. These severe punishments showed the complete control masters had over their slaves. Seen as property, slaves faced these harsh treatments as a way to keep them under control, reinforcing their low status in Greek society. Number 3. Sexual slavery and exploitation. Sexual slavery was a grim part of ancient Greek society, affecting both male and female slaves. This practice, hidden behind Greece's intellectual and democratic image, involved forcing slaves into sexual relationships with their masters. Xenophon's Oikonomikos highlights this, showing how female slaves were used for sexual pleasure completely at their owner's will. This treatment of slaves in sexual situations shows a total lack of respect for their autonomy. Sometimes female slaves were even offered as rewards to male slaves. This exploitation came with deep psychological harm and reinforced the society's inequalities and injustices. Number 2. Intellectual bondage. In ancient Greece, educated slaves, often from cultured backgrounds, faced a unique form of slavery. They were valued for their intellect and worked as tutors or scholars for their master's children. A famous example is Aesop, a 6th century BC slave known for his fables. These intellectual slaves had a complex relationship with their masters. They educated future Greek leaders, but were still enslaved, their own intellectual freedom limited. This contradiction highlights the hypocrisy of a society that celebrated philosophy but suppressed others for its advancement. These scholarly slaves saw a lot of their masters' personal lives. While they shared knowledge and culture, their own stories and ideas were mostly unrecorded, leaving us to guess their full impact on Greek society. Number 1. Rebellion and its consequences. Rebellions by Greek slaves were significant events. One notable uprising was on the island of Chios in 412 BC. The Chios slave rebellion was a key moment in ancient Greek history, happening during the Peloponnesian War. Chios, a rich island with many slaves, suddenly became the center of a fight for freedom. The rebellion was sparked by the slaves' frustration with their harsh lives, including tough labor and mistreatment. The ongoing war between Athens and Sparta created just the right chaos for them to try and break free. During the rebellion, slaves from different jobs like farming and housework united. They were all looking for a better life and briefly took control of some parts of the island. But the island's leaders quickly and brutally stopped the uprising. They put an end to it swiftly and punished the rebels harshly. This response was meant to show other slaves what would happen if they rebelled and to keep them under control. The Chios Rebellion thus stands as a bold but ultimately unsuccessful attempt by slaves to overcome their oppression in a society that, despite its achievements, was deeply rooted in slavery. Such rebellions were common in ancient Greece, and the response was always severe. The aftermath often meant tougher rules and harsher treatment for all slaves. This fear of punishment helped Greek masters control any rebellious spirit. But the desire for freedom never fully disappeared. Each rebellion and act of defiance showed the enduring human spirit's longing for freedom, even under the harshest conditions. As we reflect on this complicated history, it begs the question, how can a society so advanced in thought and governance harbor such profound inequalities and injustices? This is History Uncharted. See you next time.